captive's freedom. Lady Catherine of Dunmere had once believed Sir Tristan de Clare was the most honorable of men until she saw him standing beside her father's murderer. Now, as he stepped closer, his voice was raw. "You think I betrayed you," he murmured. "But tell me, my lady, what if I was the one betrayed?" Chapter 1. The Serpent's Kiss. The wind whipped around the battlements of Castle Dunmere, carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant echo of thunder. Lady Catherine stood silhouetted against the stormy twilight, her crimson gown a stark contrast to the gray stone. She clutched a worn, leather-bound book to her chest, its pages filled with the faded ink of her mother's hand recipes for healing balms, prayers for protection, and sketches of the wildflowers that once bloomed in the castle gardens. A life, a world, that felt a lifetime ago. Her fingers traced the outline of a pressed forget-me-not, a fragile relic of a happier time, before the serpent had slithered into their midst. Before Lord Alaric, her father, had fallen, his lifeblood staining the very stones she now stood upon. Before he had stood there, bathed in the flickering torchlight, his face a mask of cold indifference. Sir Tristan de Clare. The name itself felt like a betrayal on her tongue, a bitter taste of what once was and could never be again. He had been her father's most trusted knight, a man she had secretly admired, whose quiet strength and unwavering loyalty had seemed a beacon in the often turbulent world of courtly intrigue. She had even dared to dream, in the foolish, innocent way of a young maiden, of a future where their paths might intertwine. Foolish. Innocent. Those words were now shards of glass in her heart, each memory a fresh wound. The image of that night was seared into her memory, the clash of steel, the screams, the chilling silence that followed. And then Tristan, standing beside Lord Edric, the usurper, the man who had plunged his sword into her father's heart. Edric, with his viper's smile and eyes that held the cold gleam of ambition, had looked upon her with a chilling possessiveness that made her skin crawl. She had been paralyzed, trapped in a nightmare from which she could not awaken. Her pleas for help, for justice, had been met with Edric's mocking laughter and Tristan's silence. A silence that spoke volumes. A silence that condemned him more than any shouted accusation. Now, weeks later, the castle was draped in black, the joyous sounds of laughter and music replaced by hushed whispers and the mournful tolling of the chapel bell. Edric ruled with an iron fist, his men patrolling the halls, their eyes constantly watching, judging. Catherine felt like a prisoner in her own home, a gilded cage built on the bones of her family's legacy. A sudden gust of wind snatched at her cloak, nearly pulling her from the battlements. She stumbled, her hand instinctively reaching out to grip the cold stone. For a moment, she felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, the ground seeming to sway beneath her feet. It was the same feeling she had experienced that night, the feeling of her world tilting on its axis, of everything she had ever known and trusted crumbling around her. She closed her eyes, fighting back the wave of nausea. She would not fall. She would not break. She was a daughter of Dunmere, and even in the face of such overwhelming loss and betrayal, she would find the strength to endure. But the pain was a constant companion, a dull ache in her chest that intensified whenever she thought of Tristan. It wasn't just the betrayal of her father, of her family, that haunted her. It was the betrayal of her own heart, the shattering of a dream that had once seemed so pure, so possible. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, where the storm clouds were gathering, mirroring the turmoil within her own soul. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, cold as the rain that was beginning to fall. "My lady?" The voice startled her. It was Alara, her handmaiden, her face etched with concern. Alara was one of the few remaining servants who had been loyal to her father, a steadfast presence in the storm that had engulfed Dunmere. "You should not be out here in this weather," Alara said softly, her hand gently resting on Catherine's arm. "Lord Edric has been asking for you." Catherine stiffened. The thought of facing Edric, of enduring his leering gaze and veiled threats, filled her with a cold dread. But she knew she had no choice. She had to navigate this treacherous court, to play the role of the compliant, grieving daughter, while secretly searching for a way to reclaim what had been stolen from her. "I will come," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But first she looked back at the book in her hands, at the fragile forget-me-not, a symbol of remembrance, of loyalty, of a love that had been brutally extinguished. "There is something I must do." She tucked the book into the folds of her gown, a secret promise hidden close to her heart. She would not forget. She would not forgive. And, somehow, she would find a way to make them pay. The serpent had struck, but the Lioness of Dunmere was not yet defeated. She felt a flicker, a spark of steel entering her gaze. The game was far from over. Chapter 2. Shadows of Dunmere. The great hall of Dunmere, once a place of warmth and feasting, now felt like a tomb. The long trestle tables, usually laden with food and drink, were sparsely occupied. Lord Edric sat at the high table, his presence casting a pall over the room. He was a man of sharp angles and harsh lines, his dark hair receding from a high forehead, his eyes like chips of obsidian. He toyed with a goblet of wine, his gaze sweeping over the assembled company with a mixture of disdain and amusement. Catherine walked slowly, her head held high, her crimson gown rustling against the stone floor. Every step was an effort, a conscious act of defiance against the fear that gnawed at her insides. Elara walked a respectful pace behind, her presence a small comfort in this hostile environment. Edric watched her approach, a predatory smile playing on his lips. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice smooth as silk but laced with a subtle menace. "You grace us with your presence. I trust you are recovering from your unfortunate loss." The words were a mockery, a deliberate reminder of his role in her father's death. Catherine forced herself to meet his gaze, her expression carefully neutral. "I am, my lord," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her heart. "Grief is a slow healer, but duty calls." "Duty, indeed," Edric chuckled. "And what duty do you speak of, my lady?" He gestured towards a vacant seat beside him at the high table. It had been her father's seat. The sight of it, empty and waiting, sent a fresh wave of pain through her. Catherine hesitated, her stomach churning with revulsion. To sit beside him, to pretend to accept his authority, felt like a betrayal of everything she held sacred. But she knew she had to play the game, to bide her time, to wait for an opportunity to strike. "The duty to my people," she said, her voice gaining strength. "To ensure the well-being of Dunmere, even in these difficult times." Edric raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had clearly expected her to be cowed, broken. Her defiance, however subtle, seemed to intrigue him. "Noble sentiments, my lady," he said. "But I assure you, Dunmere is in capable hands." "My hands." He took a sip of his wine, his gaze never leaving hers. Catherine felt a shiver run down her spine. She was walking a tightrope. One wrong move could send her plummeting into the abyss. "Of course, my lord," she said, forcing a smile. "But a lady's touch can often soothe the hearts of those who mourn. I would offer my services to help in any way I can." It was a calculated risk, a way to gain access, to observe, to learn. She needed to understand Edric's plans, his weaknesses, his allies. She needed to find a way to expose him, to avenge her father's death. Edric studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled again, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a chill down her spine. "Very well, Lady Catherine," he said. "You may sit. Let us discuss how you can best serve Dunmere." As she took the seat beside him, Catherine felt a sense of unease settle over her. The shadows of Dunmere were deep and treacherous, and she was walking into them blind. But she was not alone. She had Elara, her loyal handmaiden, and she had the memory of her father, a burning ember of justice that fueled her determination. And then, her gaze fell upon a figure standing at the far end of the hall, near the entrance. It was Tristan. He was leaning against a pillar, his arms crossed, his face obscured by the shadows. But she recognized the set of his shoulders, the way he held himself, the aura of quiet strength that had once captivated her. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment across the expanse of the hall. His expression was unreadable, but Catherine thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Pain? Regret? Or was it simply a trick of the light? The moment was broken by Edric's voice, his hand resting possessively on her arm. "Pay him no mind, my lady," he said, his voice low and menacing. "He is a broken man, a shadow of his former self. He serves me now." Catherine pulled her arm away, her skin crawling at his touch. She would not let him see her fear, her weakness. She would not let him see the flicker of hope, however faint, that still burned within her heart. "He was my father's loyal knight," she said, her voice cold. "I find it difficult to believe he would so easily betray him." Edric laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Loyalty is a fickle thing, my lady," he said, "especially in times of war. And Tristan, he has his reasons." He leaned closer, his breath warm on her ear. "But that is a story for another time. Tonight, we have more important matters to discuss." Catherine forced herself to remain calm, to meet his gaze with a mask of indifference. But inside, her heart was pounding, her mind racing. Tristan's presence, his silence, his very existence, was a puzzle she could not ignore. A puzzle that held the key to her father's death, and perhaps to her own redemption. The shadows were deep, but somewhere within them, a glimmer of truth remained. And she would find it, no matter the cost. The weight of the empty seat, and all it represented, was crushing. Chapter 3. A Knight's Accusation. The days that followed were a blur of forced smiles, veiled threats, and constant surveillance. Catherine moved through the castle like a ghost, her every action scrutinized, her every word weighed. Edric was ever present, his presence a suffocating weight, his attempts at charm a constant reminder of his treachery. He spoke of alliances, of securing Dunmere's future, of a marriage that would solidify his claim to the lordship. Catherine listened, her face a mask of polite interest, while her mind raced, searching for an escape, a weakness, a crack in his armor. She found solace in the small, forgotten corners of the castle, the library, with its dusty tomes and the scent of old parchment, the chapel, where she could pray for strength and guidance, the gardens, now overgrown and neglected, but still holding the echoes of happier times. It was in the gardens, one crisp autumn afternoon, that she encountered Tristan again. He was standing by the sundial, his gaze fixed on the distant hills, his expression lost in thought. He looked older, wearier, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders slumped with a weight she could not fathom. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, to unleash the torrent of anger and grief that had been building inside her. But something held her back. A flicker of doubt, a memory of the man he had once been, a nagging feeling that there was more to the story than she knew. He turned, sensing her presence. His eyes, once so bright and full of life, now seemed shadowed, haunted. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Lady Catherine," he said, his voice low and rough, devoid of the warmth she remembered. "Sir Tristan," she replied, her voice equally guarded. I did not expect to see you here." He gave a slight shrug, his gaze shifting back to the hills. "I find the solitude soothing." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the rustling of the leaves and the distant cries of birds. Catherine struggled to find the words, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. "You are my father's most trusted knight," she finally said, her voice trembling slightly. "He spoke of you often. He valued your loyalty, your honor." Tristan flinched, as if struck by a physical blow. He turned away, his hands clenching into fists. "Your father was a good man," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "A better man than I deserved." The words were unexpected, laced with a self-loathing that surprised her. She had expected defiance, arrogance, perhaps even indifference. But not this raw, unfiltered pain. "Then why?" she asked, her voice rising in frustration. "Why did you stand beside his murderer? Why did you do nothing?" He turned back to her, his eyes blazing with a sudden intensity. "Do nothing?" he repeated, his voice laced with bitterness. You think I did nothing? He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think I betrayed you, he murmured. But tell me, my lady, what if I was the one betrayed? The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. Betrayed? By whom?
How?
I don't understand, she stammered. He looked at her, his gaze searching, probing. You saw me standing beside Edric, he said. You saw the blood on his sword. You drew your own conclusions. What else was I to think? She cried, her voice cracking with emotion. You were there. You did nothing to stop him. And what could I have done? He retorted, his voice rising in anger. One man, against Edric and his entire guard? I would have been killed, and your father would still be dead. And you would be, at Edric's mercy, with no one to protect you. His words struck a chord, a chilling realization of the truth in what he said. She had been so blinded by her grief, by her anger, that she had not considered the impossible situation he might have faced. But you serve him now, she said, her voice weaker now, her certainty faltering. I serve Dunmere, he corrected, his voice firm. I serve the memory of your father. And I serve you. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions, pain, regret, and something else, something that made her heart ache with a longing she could not deny. I know you have no reason to trust me, he said. But I swear to you, Lady Catherine, I am not your enemy. And I will do everything in my power to uncover the truth, to bring justice to your father's killer. His words were a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the darkness that had surrounded her. But could she trust him? Could she believe him? The weight of her father's death, of Edric's treachery, of her own shattered dreams, pressed down on her. But this spark of defiance, and perhaps of something else, was too powerful. Before she could find a response, a cold voice cut through the air. What is the meaning of this? It was Edric. He will make this impossible. Chapter 4. The Price of Silence. Edric stood at the edge of the garden, his face a mask of cold fury. His eyes, like chips of ice, fixed on Tristan and Catherine, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The air crackled with tension, the fragile peace of the garden shattered by his sudden appearance. I asked you a question, Sir Tristan, Edric repeated, his voice dangerously low. What are you doing here, speaking with Lady Catherine? Tristan stepped forward, placing himself between Catherine and Edric, a silent act of defiance that did not go unnoticed. I was merely offering my condolences to Lady Catherine, he said, his voice calm and measured, betraying none of the turmoil that Catherine knew he must be feeling. We were discussing her father. Edric's gaze narrowed, his suspicion evident. Her father is dead, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. There is nothing more to discuss. And you, Sir Tristan, are to keep your distance from Lady Catherine. I will not have you filling her head with untruths. The implication was clear. Edric saw Tristan as a threat, a potential source of dissent. He wanted to isolate Catherine, to keep her under his control. Catherine bristled at his words, her anger rising. I will speak to whomever I please, Lord Edric, she said, her voice trembling with defiance. You may rule Dunmere, but you do not rule me. Edric's smile was chilling. Do not test me, my lady, he said softly. You are under my protection now, and I will not tolerate insubordination from either of you. He turned his gaze back to Tristan, his eyes filled with a cold menace. You are dismissed, Sir Tristan, he said. Return to your duties. And remember your oath. Tristan hesitated, his gaze lingering on Catherine for a fleeting moment. She saw a flicker of concern in his eyes, a silent warning. He bowed his head, his expression carefully neutral. As you command, my lord, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned and walked away, his step slow and deliberate, his back ramrod straight. Catherine watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of frustration and relief. She knew he was walking a dangerous path, defying Edric, even in such a subtle way, could have dire consequences. Edric turned his attention back to Catherine, his smile returning, but it did not reach his eyes. "Now, my lady," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Where were we?" He offered her his arm, a gesture that was both possessive and threatening. Catherine forced herself to take it, her skin crawling at his touch. She had to play the game, to pretend to be compliant, while secretly plotting her revenge. "We were discussing my duties," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I believe you mentioned a marriage." Edric's smile widened, a flicker of triumph in his eyes. "Indeed," he said, "a marriage that will unite our houses, secure Dunmere's future, and bring peace to this troubled land." He led her back towards the castle, his grip on her arm tightening. Catherine felt like a prisoner being led to her execution. She knew that Edric's proposal was not a request, but a command. And she knew that refusing him would be dangerous, perhaps even fatal. But she also knew that she would not marry him. She would not betray her father's memory, her own heart, by becoming the wife of his murderer. As they walked through the castle halls, Catherine's mind raced, searching for a way out, a plan, a glimmer of hope. She thought of Tristan, of his words, his promise. Could she trust him? Could she rely on him to help her? She glanced back, over her shoulder, towards the gardens where she had last seen him. He was gone, vanished into the shadows. But she knew he was out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. And she knew that she was not alone. She had an ally, a secret weapon, a knight who had sworn to protect her, even if it meant defying the man who ruled Dunmere. The price of silence was high, but the price of speaking the truth could be even higher. Catherine knew that she was walking a tightrope, balancing between survival and rebellion. But she was determined to find her footing, to reclaim her life, her legacy, and her freedom. She would unravel this web, thread by silken thread. The feeling of Edric's hand on her arm spurred her on. Chapter 5. Whispers in the Cloister. The following days were a tense dance of deception. Catherine played the role of the grieving, compliant lady, attending to Edric's demands, enduring his veiled threats and unwanted attentions. But beneath the surface, she was a whirlwind of activity, gathering information, seeking allies, and plotting her escape. Alara, her loyal handmaiden, proved to be an invaluable asset. She had access to the castle's inner workings, the servants' whispers, the guards' gossip. She reported back to Catherine, relaying snippets of information, rumors of discontent, and hints of Edric's plans. One piece of information, in particular, caught Catherine's attention. Alara reported that Tristan had been spending time at the nearby monastery of St. Michael, a secluded sanctuary known for its library and its healing gardens. The monks of St. Michael were renowned for their wisdom and their discretion, and they had a long history of providing refuge to those in need. Catherine saw an opportunity. She needed to speak to Tristan, to learn more about his claims of betrayal, to understand his plans, to forge an alliance. But she could not risk another encounter within the castle walls, under Edric's watchful eye. The monastery offered a neutral ground, a place where they could speak freely, away from prying eyes and listening ears. She devised a plan, carefully crafted and fraught with risk. She would feign illness, a sudden ailment that required the attention of a skilled healer. She would request that Alara fetch a poultice from the monastery, a remedy known only to the monks of St. Michael. It was a plausible excuse, a way to escape the castle, if only for a few hours. The next morning, Catherine put her plan into action. She complained of a severe headache, a throbbing pain that made her sensitive to light and sound. She retired to her chambers, refusing food and drink, her face pale and drawn. Alara played her part perfectly, expressing concern, hovering over her mistress, and suggesting the poultice from St. Michael. Edric, initially dismissive, eventually relented, his concern for Catherine's well-being, or rather, his concern for the potential loss of his prize, outweighing his suspicions. He granted Alara permission to leave the castle, accompanied by a small guard, of course. Catherine watched from her window as Alara departed, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She knew that she was taking a huge risk, but she had no other choice. Hours passed, agonizingly slow. Catherine paced her chambers, her nerves frayed, her mind racing. She imagined every possible scenario, every potential outcome, from success to capture to betrayal. Finally, as the sun began to set, Elara returned. She rushed to Catherine's side, her face flushed with excitement, her eyes shining with a secret. "He is waiting for you," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible. "In the cloister garden," he said to come alone. Catherine's heart leaped with a mixture of relief and trepidation. She had done it. She had created an opportunity to speak to Tristan, to unravel the web of lies that surrounded her. She slipped out of her chambers unnoticed and made her way through the deserted corridors of the castle. The air was cool and still, the silence broken only by the sound of her own footsteps. She reached the cloister garden, a hidden oasis of peace and tranquility. The scent of herbs and flowers filled the air, a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. And there, standing beneath the ancient oak tree, was Tristan. He turned as she approached, his face etched with concern. "You came," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Are you well?" "I had to see you," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I had to know the truth." He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "I know," he said, "and I will tell you everything. But we must be careful. We are not safe here." He led her to a secluded corner of the garden, hidden from view by a thick hedge of rosemary. They sat on a stone bench, the silence between them heavy with unspoken words. "Tell me," Catherine said, her voice barely a whisper. "Tell me what happened that night. Tell me who betrayed you." Tristan took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "It is a long story," he said, "and a painful one." He hesitated, and Catherine could see the hesitation, the battle scars on his soul. This would not be easy for either of them. Chapter 6. The Falcon's Flight. Tristan began his tale, his voice low and heavy with the weight of memory. He spoke of his early years at Dunmere, his training as a knight, his unwavering loyalty to Lord Alaric. He described Alaric as a father figure, a mentor, a man he respected and admired above all others. "He trusted me," Tristan said, his voice thick with emotion. "He entrusted me with his life, with the safety of his family, with the future of Dunmere." He paused, his gaze shifting to Catherine, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow. "And I failed him," he whispered. "I failed him in the worst possible way." He described the night of the attack, the suddenness of it, the chaos, the confusion. He had been patrolling the outer walls of the castle when he heard the screams. He had rushed back, his sword drawn, ready to defend his lord. But he had been too late. He had arrived at the great hall to find Alaric lying on the floor, his lifeblood staining the stones, Edric standing over him, his sword dripping with blood. "I attacked him," Tristan said, his voice raw with anger. "I fought him with all my strength, but he was too strong, too skilled. And he had help." He described how Edric's men had surrounded him, disarmed him, and held him captive. He had been forced to watch, helpless, as Edric declared himself the new Lord of Dunmere, his claim solidified by the blood of his predecessor. "They gave me a choice," Tristan said, his voice laced with bitterness. "Swear fealty to Edric, or die." "They threatened to harm you, Catherine. They said they would make you Edric's prize." His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with suppressed rage. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine, the realization of the danger she had been in, the sacrifice Tristan had made. "I had no choice," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I swore the oath. I became his servant. But I did it to protect you, Catherine, to buy time, to find a way to avenge your father's death." He looked at her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I know you despise me," he said. "I know you think I betrayed you. But I swear to you, Catherine, I would never willingly harm you or your family. I am still loyal to Dunmere, to your father's memory, to you." Catherine listened, her heart aching with a mixture of grief, anger, and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. She wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the wounds of betrayal were still too fresh, the scars too deep. "But why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Why didn't you explain, that night in the garden? He sighed, his shoulders slumping with weariness. I couldn't, he said. Edric's men were everywhere. He was watching me, listening to every word. If I had revealed the truth, he would have killed me, and he would have made good on his threats against you. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. I had to play the part, he said. I had to pretend to be his loyal servant, while secretly working against him. I had to wait for the right moment. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden falcon. It was a symbol of House Dunmere, a token of loyalty and courage. My father gave me this, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He told me to always remember my oath, to never betray my honor, to never give up hope. He held it out to Catherine, his hand trembling slightly. I have kept it hidden, he said. A reminder of my true allegiance. A promise of the day when I would be free to reclaim my honor and to avenge your father's death. Catherine took the falcon, her fingers tracing the smooth, worn wood. It was a tangible symbol of his loyalty, a proof of his words, a testament to the man he had once been and the man he still hoped to be. As she held it, she felt a shift in her heart, a crack in the wall of anger and mistrust that she had built around herself. She looked at Tristan, really looked at him, and she saw not a traitor, but a man trapped in a web of deceit, a knight fighting for redemption, a soul yearning for justice. A risk, but one she was increasingly willing to take. A sudden noise, the snapping of a twig, startled them both. They turned, their eyes scanning the shadows. Someone was watching them. The falcon's flight was still grounded. Chapter 7. Beneath a Bloodied Moon. The sound had come from the deeper shadows of the cloister, near the crumbling wall that bordered the monastery's herb garden. Tristan rose instantly, his hand moving to the hilt of the dagger he kept concealed beneath his tunic. He gestured for Catherine to stay behind him, his body shielding her from any potential threat. Who's there? He called out, his voice low and commanding. Show yourself. Silence. Only the rustling of leaves in the evening breeze and the distant hooting of an owl. Tristan moved slowly, cautiously, towards the source of the noise, his senses on high alert. Catherine held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She clutched the wooden falcon in her hand, its smooth surface a source of comfort and strength. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a young monk, his face pale and frightened, his eyes wide with alarm. He stumbled forward, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. Forgive me, Sir Knight, he stammered, his voice trembling. I did not mean to intrude. I was gathering herbs for the infirmary. Tristan relaxed slightly, but his hand remained on his dagger. He studied the monk, his gaze searching, probing. He recognized him as Brother Thomas, a novice known for his quiet demeanor and his dedication to the healing arts. Brother Thomas, Tristan said, his voice still guarded. What are you doing here at this hour? The gardens are closed after sunset. The young monk swallowed nervously, his gaze darting between Tristan and Catherine. I know, Sir Knight, he said, but there was a request. A special remedy. For Lady Catherine. Catherine stepped forward, her surprise evident. For me? She asked. But I did not request anything. Brother Thomas looked confused, his brow furrowed. But the message, he stammered. It came from Alara. She said Lady Catherine was in need of a rare herb, one that only grows in this part of the garden. Catherine and Tristan exchanged a look of alarm. Alara was still at the castle, under Edric's watchful eye. She could not have sent any message. It's a trick, Catherine said, her voice low and urgent. Someone is trying to lure us out, to expose us. Tristan nodded, his suspicions confirmed. Edric, he said, his voice grim. He must know. He must have followed us. He turned back to Brother Thomas, his expression softening. Thank you, brother, he said. You have been most helpful. But you must go now. It is not safe for you here. The young monk hesitated, his eyes filled with concern. But Lady Catherine, he said. What about the remedy? There is no remedy, Catherine said, her voice firm. It was a lie. A trap. You must return to the monastery and tell no one of what you have seen here." Brother Thomas nodded, his understanding dawning. He bowed his head, his face pale but resolute. "I will do as you ask, my lady," he said. "May God protect you both." He turned and hurried away, disappearing into the shadows of the cloister. Tristan and Catherine were alone again, the silence now heavy with danger. "We have to leave," Tristan said, his voice urgent. "Edric's men will be here soon." He took Catherine's hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We'll go through the back gate," he said. "It leads to the forest. We can hide there until morning." They moved quickly, silently, through the darkened garden, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. They reached the back gate, a small, wooden door hidden behind a thick wall of ivy. Tristan checked the lock, his brow furrowed. "It's been tampered with," he said, his voice grim. "Someone has been here before us." He pushed the gate open, revealing a narrow path that led into the dense forest. The moon, full and bright, cast an eerie glow over the landscape, illuminating the trees with a silvery light. But tonight it felt bloodied, tainted. As they stepped through the gate, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps, the clinking of armor, the muffled voices of men. Edric's guards. They were closing in. "Run," Tristan said, his voice urgent. "Run, Catherine." He pushed her forward, urging her into the darkness of the forest. They ran, their hearts pounding, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The sounds of pursuit grew closer, the shouts of the guards echoing through the trees. They were being hunted like animals, their freedom, their lives, hanging in the balance. But they were not defeated. They had each other, a shared purpose, a burning desire for justice. And they would not give up, not until they had exposed Edric's treachery and reclaimed what had been stolen from them. The hunt had begun, beneath a bloodied moon. Chapter 8. The Lion and the Lamb. The forest was a labyrinth of shadows and tangled undergrowth, a treacherous maze that offered both concealment and danger. Tristan, with his experience as a knight and his knowledge of the surrounding lands, led the way, guiding Catherine through the darkness, his hand firmly clasped in hers. They moved swiftly, silently, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the hooting of owls, and the snapping of twigs under their feet. Catherine stumbled, her breath catching in her throat. She was exhausted, her legs aching, her lungs burning. But she dared not stop. She knew that Edric's men were relentless, and they would not rest until they had captured them. Tristan sensed her fatigue. He slowed his pace, his grip tightening on her hand. "We'll rest soon," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "Just a little further." They reached a small clearing, bathed in the silvery light of the moon. A towering oak tree stood at the center, its branches reaching towards the sky, like the arms of a giant. Tristan led Catherine to the base of the tree, its massive trunk providing a semblance of shelter. They sat down, leaning against the rough bark, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing. Catherine looked at Tristan, his face illuminated by the moonlight. She saw the lines of fatigue, the worry in his eyes, the determination that still burned within him. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. For everything." He smiled, a faint, weary smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "We are in this together, Catherine," he said. "I will not let him harm you." He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small flask of water and a piece of dried meat. He offered them to Catherine, his hand brushing hers. She took them, her fingers lingering on his for a moment longer than necessary. They ate and drank in silence, the small offering a meager sustenance, but enough to restore some of their strength. Catherine felt a sense of gratitude towards Tristan, a growing trust that was slowly replacing the anger and mistrust she had harbored for so long. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice low and uncertain. "Where will we go?" Tristan sighed, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I don't know," he admitted. "We are outlaws now, hunted by Edric. We have no allies, no resources, no safe haven." He paused, his expression turning grim. But we have one advantage, he said. Edric thinks he has broken us. He thinks we are defeated. He underestimates us. He looked at Catherine, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. We will use that to our advantage, he said. We will strike back when he least expects it. We will expose his treachery, and we will reclaim Dunmere. Catherine felt a surge of hope, a flicker of courage ignited by his words. She was not alone. She had Tristan, a skilled warrior, a loyal ally, a man who had sworn to protect her, even at the cost of his own life. But how? She asked. We are just two people against Edric and his entire army. Tristan smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that sent a shiver down her spine. We may be outnumbered, he said, but we are not outmatched. We have something he doesn't have. What is that? Catherine asked, her curiosity piqued. We have the truth, he said. And the truth is a powerful weapon. We have the people, too. They do not love him. He paused, his gaze meeting hers. We also have each other, he added, his voice softening. And that is more than enough. As they sat there, beneath the watchful gaze of the moon, Catherine felt a shift in her heart. The fear, the uncertainty, the grief were still there, but they were tempered by a growing sense of hope, of determination, of something else. Something that felt dangerously close to love. A lioness and her unlikely protector. She saw not a lamb, but a man hardened by battle and softened by a cause. She would fight alongside him, her own resolve hardening. Chapter 9. Scars of the Past. The first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of pink and gold, filtering through the dense canopy of the forest, casting dappled shadows on the ground. Catherine and Tristan awoke stiff and sore, their bodies aching from the night spent on the hard earth. But the urgency of their situation spurred them on. They shared the last of their meager supplies, a few scraps of dried meat and a handful of berries that Tristan had managed to forage. They knew they needed to find a safe haven, a place to rest, to plan, to gather their strength. There is a village, Tristan said, his voice low and thoughtful. A small settlement, hidden deep in the forest. It is called Oakhaven. The people there are independent. They do not owe allegiance to any lord, and they are fiercely protective of their own. He paused, his expression turning grim. But it is a risk, he added. They are wary of strangers, and they will not welcome us with open arms. We will have to earn their trust. Catherine nodded, her understanding dawning. It was a long shot, but it was their only option. They could not return to Dunmere, and they could not survive in the wilderness alone. They set off, moving cautiously through the forest, avoiding the main paths, sticking to the shadows. Tristan led the way, his senses on high alert, his hand never far from his dagger. As they walked, Catherine found herself studying Tristan, observing the way he moved, the way he listened, the way he scanned the surrounding landscape. She saw the scars of his past, the lines of hardship etched on his face, the haunted look in his eyes. She wanted to know more about him, to understand the burdens he carried, the secrets he held. She wanted to break down the walls he had built around himself, to reach the man beneath the armor. Tristan, she said softly, her voice barely audible above the rustling of the leaves. Tell me about your life. Before Dunmere. He glanced at her, his expression surprised. He hesitated, his gaze shifting away, his past a clearly painful subject. There is not much to tell, he said, his voice guarded. I was born a commoner, in a small village far from here. My father was a blacksmith, my mother a weaver. I was ordinary. He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. But I always dreamed of being a knight, he added, his voice filled with a wistful longing. I dreamed of serving a noble lord, of fighting for justice, of protecting the innocent. He described how he had left his village at a young age, seeking his fortune, his skills with a sword his only asset. He had traveled far and wide, fighting in tournaments, serving various lords, earning a reputation as a skilled and honorable warrior. And then I met your father, he said, his voice softening. He saw something in me, something more than just a warrior. He took me under his wing, trained me, taught me, treated me like a son. His voice cracked with emotion, his eyes filled with a deep sorrow.
He gave me a purpose, he said.
He gave me a home.
He gave me everything.
Catherine felt a pang of sympathy for him, a deep understanding of the loss he had suffered. She knew what it was like to lose a father, to have your world shattered, to feel the weight of grief and betrayal. I am sorry, she said softly, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. I know it must have been difficult. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions, pain, gratitude, and something else. Something that made her heart ache with a longing she could not deny. It was, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. But meeting you, Catherine, has given me hope. It has reminded me of what I am fighting for. It has given me a reason to live. His words, spoken with such sincerity, such vulnerability, touched her deeply. She felt a connection to him, a bond forged in shared loss, shared struggle, shared purpose. The scars were still visible, but they seemed to tell a new story. They walked on in silence, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. The sun climbed higher in the sky, the forest awakening around them. They were two souls, scarred by the past, bound by the present, uncertain of the future. But they were not alone. They had each other. And that, for now, was enough. The village awaited. Chapter 10. A Tapestry of Lies. Oakhaven was a cluster of humble dwellings nestled in a small valley, surrounded by towering trees and a murmuring stream. Smoke curled from chimneys, the scent of wood smoke and cooking food mingling with the fresh, earthy smell of the forest. It was a scene of rustic tranquility, a world away from the intrigue and danger of Castle Dunmere. But Tristan knew that appearances could be deceiving. The villagers of Oakhaven were fiercely independent, wary of outsiders, and protective of their way of life. They had a history of resisting the demands of feudal lords, and they would not welcome strangers, especially a knight and a noblewoman, with open arms. As they approached the village, Tristan cautioned Catherine to remain silent, to let him do the talking. He knew that her noble bearing and refined speech would immediately mark her as an outsider, a potential threat. They were met by a group of villagers, men and women armed with pitchforks, axes, and hunting bows. Their faces were weathered and hardened, their eyes filled with suspicion. A tall, powerfully built man with a grizzled beard stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Tristan. "State your business," he said, his voice gruff and unwelcoming. "We don't take kindly to strangers here." Tristan met his gaze, his expression calm and respectful. "We seek shelter," he said, his voice low and steady. "We are travelers, weary and in need of rest. We mean you no harm." The man, who introduced himself as Elder Gareth, studied Tristan and Catherine with a critical eye. He saw the fine clothes, the knightly bearing, the air of nobility that clung to them despite their attempts to conceal it. "Travelers?" he scoffed. "You look more like runaways. What are you running from?" Tristan hesitated, knowing that the truth would likely be met with disbelief and hostility. He had to choose his words carefully, to weave a tale that would be plausible, yet protective of their true identities. "We are fleeing injustice," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We have been wrongly accused, our lives threatened. We seek only a place to hide, to regroup, to plan our next move." Elder Gareth remained unconvinced. He exchanged glances with the other villagers, their expressions skeptical. "And what injustice is that?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Who has accused you?" Tristan took a deep breath, knowing that he was walking a tightrope. He could not reveal Edric's name, nor could he speak of the events at Dunmere. He had to create a believable lie, a tapestry of half-truths that would conceal their true identities while appealing to the villagers' sense of justice. "We were servants of a powerful lord," he said, choosing his words carefully. "A lord who abused his power. He accused us of theft, of treachery, of crimes we did not commit. He threatened to imprison us, to torture us, to kill us." He paused, his gaze meeting Catherine's. She nodded slightly, her expression carefully neutral, supporting his fabricated tale. "We fled," Tristan continued. "We had no choice. We seek only sanctuary, a place to declare our names, to define justice. Elder Gareth listened intently, his gaze unwavering. He studied Tristan and Catherine, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of falsehood. He saw the fatigue in their eyes, the desperation in their voices, the genuine fear that lurked beneath their carefully constructed facade. He turned to the other villagers, his expression unreadable. "What say you?" he asked. "Shall we offer them shelter?" The villagers murmured amongst themselves, their opinions divided. Some were wary, suspicious, unwilling to trust these strangers. Others were more sympathetic, moved by their plight, willing to offer them a chance. Finally, an old woman, her face wrinkled and wise, stepped forward. She looked at Catherine, her eyes filled with a deep understanding. "Let them stay," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "I see no evil in their hearts, only sorrow and fear and hope." Her words swayed the others. Elder Gareth hesitated, then nodded, his decision made. "Very well," he said, his voice still gruff, but with a hint of grudging respect. "You may stay, but you will abide by our rules. You will work for your keep, and you will not bring trouble to our village." Tristan and Catherine breathed a sigh of relief, their tension easing slightly. They had been granted a reprieve, a temporary sanctuary, but they knew that their safety was precarious, their future uncertain. They had woven a tapestry of lies to survive. Now they were a part of it. The first threads had held. Chapter 11. The Tournament of Treachery. Days turned into weeks, and Catherine and Tristan settled into the rhythm of life in Oakhaven. They worked alongside the villagers, tending the fields, mending fences, caring for the animals. Catherine, despite her noble upbringing, adapted quickly, her hands becoming calloused, her body growing stronger. Tristan, with his skills as a warrior and a craftsman, proved to be a valuable asset to the community. They kept their true identities hidden, posing as a brother and sister, fleeing a cruel master. They earned the trust of the villagers, their hard work and quiet demeanor gradually dispelling the initial suspicion. They found a measure of peace in the simplicity of their lives, the camaraderie of the community, the escape from the constant threat of Edric's pursuit. But they never forgot their purpose. They continued to gather information, listening to travelers' tales, gleaning snippets of news from the outside world. They learned that Edric had consolidated his power at Dunmere, strengthening his defenses, forging alliances with neighboring lords. He had also announced a grand tournament, a spectacle of martial skill and chivalry, designed to showcase his power and attract potential allies. The tournament was a dangerous opportunity. It was a chance to observe Edric, to assess his strength, to identify his allies and his weaknesses. It was also a chance to be recognized, to be captured, to be killed. Tristan was hesitant, wary of the risks. But Catherine was determined. She saw the tournament as a chance to strike back, to expose Edric's treachery, to reclaim her birthright. "We have to go," she insisted, her voice firm and resolute. "It is our best chance to get close to him, to find a way to defeat him." Tristan argued, pointing out the dangers, the near impossibility of their task. But he saw the fire in her eyes, the unwavering determination that had sustained her through so much hardship. He knew that he could not dissuade her, and he would not abandon her. He agreed, reluctantly but with a condition. They would go disguised, not as combatants, but as spectators. They would observe, gather information, and wait for the right moment to act. They prepared carefully, altering their appearances, adopting new identities. Catherine, with her knowledge of herbs and dyes, darkened her hair and tanned her skin, transforming herself into a common serving girl. Tristan, with his skills as a blacksmith, crafted a simple disguise, posing as a traveling merchant, his face obscured by a hooded cloak. They set off, joining the throngs of people heading towards Dunmere. The castle loomed in the distance, a symbol of Edric's power, a reminder of Catherine's loss, a beacon of their uncertain future. As they approached the tournament grounds, Catherine felt a surge of emotions: fear, excitement, anger, determination. She saw the banners of various noble houses, the colorful tents of the knights and their retinues, the crowds of spectators eager for spectacle. And then she saw him. Edric. He was seated on a raised platform, surrounded by his court, his face a mask of arrogance and power. He looked every bit the usurper, the tyrant, the murderer. Catherine's blood boiled with rage. She wanted to rush forward, to confront him, to denounce him before the assembled crowd. But Tristan restrained her, his hand firmly grasping her arm. "Not yet," he whispered, his voice urgent. "We have to wait. We have to be patient." They watched the tournament unfold, the clash of steel, the thunder of hooves, the cheers of the crowd. Knights from various houses competed, displaying their skill and courage, vying for Edric's favor. But Catherine's attention was focused on Edric, on his interactions with the other nobles, on the whispers and glances that passed between them. She was looking for a weakness, a vulnerability, a crack in his armor. As the day wore on, she noticed something. Edric was particularly attentive to one knight, a tall, powerfully built man with a cruel face and a reputation for ruthlessness. Sir Kelric. He was a known mercenary, a warrior for hire, with no loyalty to any house but his own. Catherine realized that Kelric was Edric's key ally, his enforcer, the man he relied upon to maintain his power. She also realized that Kelric was a weakness, a vulnerability, a potential target. The tournament was not just a display of chivalry, it was a tapestry of treachery, woven with ambition, betrayal, and hidden agendas. And Catherine was determined to unravel it, thread by bloody thread. This was the perfect scene. Chapter 12. Echoes in the Stone. The tournament continued into the evening, the setting sun casting long shadows across the field. Torches were lit, illuminating the scene with a flickering, dramatic light. The final joust was about to begin, Sir Kelric against a young, relatively unknown knight from a minor house. Catherine and Tristan watched from the edge of the crowd, their disguises holding, their identities concealed. Catherine's mind raced, analyzing the situation, searching for an opportunity. She knew that Kelric was Edric's right-hand man, his most trusted and brutal enforcer. If she could somehow discredit him, expose him, weaken him, it would be a significant blow to Edric's power.
But how?
She needed proof, evidence, something tangible that she could use to expose his treachery. She couldn't simply accuse him, she needed something more concrete. As the joust began, Catherine's gaze drifted towards the castle, towards the walls that held so many memories, so much pain, so much history. She remembered the stories her father had told her, tales of Dunmere's past, of its secrets, of its hidden passages, of its forgotten chambers. An idea sparked in her mind, a daring, dangerous plan. She remembered a particular story, a legend of a secret chamber, hidden beneath the castle, where the lords of Dunmere had kept their most valuable treasures, their most sensitive documents, their darkest secrets. If she could find that chamber, if she could gain access to it, she might find something, anything, that she could use to expose Edric, to prove his treachery, to reclaim her birthright. She turned to Tristan, her eyes shining with a sudden, fierce determination. "I know what to do," she whispered, her voice urgent. "I know how to get the proof we need." Tristan looked at her, his concern evident. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "What proof?" Catherine explained her plan, her voice low and rapid, outlining the legend of the secret chamber, her belief that it held the key to Edric's downfall. Tristan listened, his initial skepticism gradually giving way to a grudging admiration. It was a long shot, a dangerous gamble, but it was also their best, perhaps their only, chance. "It's too risky," he said, his voice filled with concern. "If you're caught, I have to try," Catherine interrupted, her voice firm. "I have to for my father, for Dunmere, for us." Tristan hesitated, his gaze searching hers. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unwavering determination that had sustained her through so much hardship. He knew that he could not dissuade her, and he would not abandon her. "All right," he said, his voice resigned but resolute. "We'll do it. Together." They waited until nightfall, until the tournament had ended. The crowds had dispersed. The castle had fallen into a semblance of quiet. They slipped away from the remaining revelers unnoticed, their movements stealthy, their hearts pounding. They made their way towards the castle, avoiding the guards, sticking to the shadows. Catherine led the way, her memory guiding her, her knowledge of the castle's layout proving invaluable. They reached a small, forgotten door, hidden behind a thick tapestry in a deserted corridor. Catherine remembered her father showing it to her, years ago, a secret entrance to a network of hidden passages that ran beneath the castle. Tristan forced the lock, the door creaking open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase that descended into the depths of the earth. They entered, the door closing behind them, sealing them in the silence and darkness of the castle's underbelly. The air was cold and damp, the silence broken only by the sound of their own breathing and the occasional drip of water. They moved slowly, cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the stone corridors. They were walking through the bones of Dunmere, through the echoes of its past, through the secrets that lay hidden beneath its imposing facade. Catherine felt a shiver run down her spine, a sense of unease, of anticipation, of connection. She was not just reclaiming her birthright, she was reclaiming her history, her heritage, her identity. She was walking in the footsteps of her ancestors, following the path that led to justice, to redemption, to truth. The very stones seemed to hold their breath. Chapter 13. The Serpent's Return. The passages beneath Dunmere were a labyrinth, a twisting network of tunnels and chambers that seemed to stretch on forever. Catherine, guided by her memory and a flickering torch Tristan had managed to procure, led the way, her senses on high alert. The air was thick with the smell of dust and damp earth, the silence broken only by the occasional scuttling of rats and the drip of water. They encountered locked doors, collapsed tunnels, and dead ends, their progress slow and frustrating. But Catherine pressed on, driven by a fierce determination, fueled by the hope of finding something, anything, that could expose Edric's treachery. After what seemed like an eternity, they reached a large, circular chamber. The torchlight revealed walls lined with ancient shelves, filled with dusty tomes, crumbling scrolls, and forgotten artifacts. It was a repository of Dunmere's history, a treasure trove of forgotten knowledge. "This is it," Catherine whispered, her voice filled with awe and excitement. "This is the secret chamber." Tristan looked around, his expression impressed. "Incredible," he murmured. "But where do we start?" They began to search, their hands carefully sifting through the dusty relics, their eyes scanning the faded inscriptions, their minds racing. They found ancient charters, family trees, records of births and deaths, treaties and alliances. But nothing that directly implicated Edric. Hours passed, and their hope began to dwindle. They were exhausted, their eyes strained, their hands covered in dust. They were about to give up when Catherine noticed something peculiar. A section of the wall behind one of the shelves seemed different. The stones were smoother, less weathered, as if they had been recently disturbed. She called Tristan over, her voice trembling with excitement. "Look," she said, pointing to the wall. "Something's not right here." Tristan examined the wall, his fingers tracing the outlines of the stones. He pressed on one of the stones, and it moved, clicking slightly. He pressed again, harder, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a hidden passage. They exchanged a look of triumph, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They had found it, a secret within a secret. They stepped through the opening, the torchlight illuminating a small, narrow chamber. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. In the center of the chamber stood a single wooden chest, bound with iron and secured with a heavy padlock. Tristan forced the lock, the chest creaking open, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a collection of letters, bound together with a ribbon. Catherine recognized the seal on the ribbon. It was her father's seal. She carefully lifted the letters, her hands trembling. She untied the ribbon and began to read. The words were written in her father's hand, a chronicle of his growing suspicions about Edric, his concerns about his ambition, his fears of his treachery. The final letter, dated just days before his death, was a chilling revelation. Alaric wrote of discovering Edric's plot to assassinate him, to seize control of Dunmere, to forge an alliance with a neighboring kingdom, a kingdom that was a long-standing enemy of their own. Catherine gasped, her eyes filling with tears. It was all there, in black and white, the proof of Edric's treachery, the confirmation of her worst fears. "We have it," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We have the proof." Tristan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his expression grim but resolute.
"We do," he said.
"And we will use it to bring him down." As they turned to leave, a voice echoed through the chamber, a voice that sent a chill down Catherine's spine. "Looking for something, my lady?" It was Edric. He stood at the entrance to the hidden chamber, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes blazing with hatred. He was flanked by Sir Kelric and a dozen armed guards. The serpent had returned. They had found him. Chapter 14. A Dance with Darkness. Edric's smile was a cruel mockery, a predator savoring the capture of its prey. "I must say, Catherine," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I am impressed. You are far more resourceful than I gave you credit for." Catherine stood her ground, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. She clutched the letters to her chest, the proof of his treachery her only weapon. "You murdered my father," she said, her voice trembling with rage.
"You stole my birthright."
"You betrayed Dunmere." Edric laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the chamber. "Sentimentality, my dear," he said. "A weakness I do not share. Your father was a fool, a weakling. He stood in my way. I removed him."
Simple as that.
"You will pay for your crimes," Catherine said, her voice rising in anger. "I will expose you. I will see you brought to justice." Edric's smile widened, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down her spine. "And how do you propose to do that, my lady?" he asked. "You are trapped, outnumbered, outmatched. You have nothing." He gestured towards the guards, their swords drawn, their faces grim. "You and your pet knight are no match for me," he said. "Your little game is over." Tristan stepped forward, placing himself between Catherine and Edric, his hand resting on the hilt of his dagger. "Leave her alone, Edric," he said, his voice low and menacing. "This is between you and me." Edric's gaze shifted to Tristan, his eyes filled with a cold hatred. "Ah, the loyal dog," he sneered. "Still clinging to the memory of your dead master. You should have stayed silent, Tristan. You should have accepted your fate." "I will never accept your treachery," Tristan retorted, his voice firm. "I will fight you to the death." Edric laughed again, a sound devoid of any mirth. "Brave words, Sir Knight," he said, "but ultimately futile. You cannot win." He signaled to his guards and they moved forward, surrounding Tristan and Catherine, their swords poised to strike. Catherine felt a surge of fear, but she refused to show it. She would not give Edric the satisfaction of seeing her break. "There is one thing you forgot, Edric," she said, her voice clear and strong. "The truth. I have proof of your crimes, and I will make sure everyone knows it." She held up the letters, her hand trembling slightly. Edric's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He had not expected this defiance, this evidence. "Give me those letters, Catherine," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And I might spare your life." "Never," Catherine said, her voice unwavering. "These letters will be your downfall." Edric's face contorted with rage. "Kill them," he roared, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Kill them both." The guards lunged forward, their swords flashing in the torchlight. Tristan drew his dagger, his movements swift and deadly. He parried the first blow, his blade deflecting the steel, his body moving with the grace and skill of a seasoned warrior. A desperate struggle ensued, a dance with darkness, a fight for survival. Tristan fought with the ferocity of a cornered lion, his dagger a blur of motion, his body a shield protecting Catherine. Catherine, despite her lack of training, refused to cower. She used the letters as a weapon, striking at the guards, distracting them, giving Tristan an opening. It was a chaotic, brutal fight, the clash of steel, the grunts of pain, the cries of anger filling the chamber. Tristan, despite his skill, was outnumbered, overwhelmed. He was taking hits, his body bleeding, his strength waning. Catherine knew that they could not win. They were trapped, surrounded, doomed. But she would not give up. She would fight to her last breath, for her father, for Dunmere, for Tristan. She would not let Edric win. The dance was far from over, but the music was fading. Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. The fight raged on, a whirlwind of steel and fury. Tristan, despite his wounds, fought with a desperate courage, protecting Catherine, deflecting blows, striking back with every ounce of his strength. But he was weakening, his movements slowing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Catherine saw him falter, a guard's sword piercing his shoulder, a cry of pain escaping his lips. She screamed, her heart lurching with fear. She threw herself at the guard, her small, untrained body a desperate shield.
No,
she cried, her voice filled with anguish. Leave him alone. The guard, surprised by her sudden attack, stumbled back, giving Tristan a moment to recover. He pushed Catherine behind him, his body shielding her from the onslaught. Catherine, he said, his voice strained, his breath coming in ragged gasps. You have to get out of here. Take the letters, go. No, she said, her voice trembling. I won't leave you. You have to, he insisted, his eyes pleading with her. You have to expose him. You have to save Dunmere. He pushed her towards the secret passage, his body blocking the guards, giving her a chance to escape. Catherine hesitated, her heart torn between her desire to stay and fight beside him, and her duty to fulfill her father's wishes, to bring Edric to justice. She looked at Tristan, his face pale and bloodied, his eyes filled with a love and a sacrifice that took her breath away. She knew what she had to do. I love you, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Tristan smiled, a faint, weary smile that reached his eyes. And you, he whispered back. With a final, heart-wrenching look, Catherine turned and fled, disappearing into the darkness of the secret passage. She ran, her heart pounding, her tears blurring her vision, the letters clutched tightly in her hand. She heard the sounds of the fight behind her, the clash of steel, the cries of pain, the roar of Edric's voice. She knew that Tristan was fighting for her, buying her time, sacrificing himself to give her a chance to escape. She emerged from the secret passage, back into the network of tunnels beneath the castle. She had to find a way out, a way to reach the surface, a way to expose Edric's treachery. She ran, blindly, desperately, her mind racing, her body exhausted. She stumbled, fell, picked herself up, and ran again. She had to keep going for Tristan, for her father, for Dunmere. She finally reached a small, forgotten door, hidden behind a crumbling wall. She forced it open, emerging into the cool night air, the moon shining brightly above her. She was outside the castle, free from Edric's immediate grasp. But she was not safe. She was alone, hunted, exhausted, her heart broken by Tristan's sacrifice. But she had the letters, the proof of Edric's treachery. And she would not rest until she had used them to bring him down, to avenge her father's death, to reclaim her birthright, to honor Tristan's sacrifice. She looked back at the castle, a dark, imposing silhouette against the night sky. She knew that Tristan was still inside, fighting, perhaps dying. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, cold as the night air. But beneath the grief, beneath the fear, a flicker of determination still burned within her. She would not give up. She would not be defeated. She would fight on, for love, for justice, for redemption. She would tell the world what had happened, even if it was the last thing she did. This was her reckoning. Chapter 16. Beyond the Walls of Duty. Catherine fled into the forest, the darkness her only ally. She ran until she could run no more, her lungs burning, her legs aching, her body exhausted. She collapsed beneath a towering oak tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her tears flowing freely. She clutched the letters to her chest, their presence a small comfort in the overwhelming despair that threatened to consume her. She thought of Tristan, of his bravery, his sacrifice, his love. She imagined him fighting, bleeding, perhaps dead. The thought was unbearable, a crushing weight that threatened to break her spirit. But she could not give in to grief, not yet. She had a duty to fulfill, a promise to keep. She had to expose Edric, to avenge her father, to honor Tristan's sacrifice. She forced herself to stand, her legs shaky, her body trembling. She had to keep moving, to find a safe haven, to reach someone, anyone, who could help her. She remembered Oakhaven, the village that had offered them shelter, the people who had shown them kindness. It was a long shot, but it was her only hope. She set off, walking through the forest, her steps slow and unsteady. She avoided the main paths, sticking to the shadows, her senses on high alert. She knew that Edric's men would be searching for her, and she could not afford to be caught. As she walked, she began to formulate a plan. She could not simply return to Oakhaven. She needed to reach someone of influence, someone who could challenge Edric's power, someone who could bring him to justice. She thought of Lord Elmsworth, a neighboring lord who had been a close friend of her father's. He was known for his integrity, his sense of justice, his loyalty to the crown. If she could reach him, if she could show him the letters, she might be able to convince him to help her. It was a dangerous plan, a long journey, a near impossible task. But she had no other choice. She had to try. As dawn approached, she reached the outskirts of Oakhaven. She dared not enter the village, fearing that Edric's men might be watching. She found a secluded spot, hidden amongst the trees, and waited. She watched as the villagers awoke, going about their daily routines. She saw Elder Gareth, his face etched with concern, his eyes scanning the surrounding landscape. She knew that he was worried about them, about their sudden disappearance. She waited until she saw Alara, her loyal handmaiden, leaving the village, heading towards the forest. She recognized her walk, her posture, her unwavering loyalty. She stepped out of the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. "Alara," she called out, her voice low and urgent. Alara turned, her eyes widening in surprise and relief. She rushed towards Catherine, her face filled with concern. "My lady," she said, her voice trembling. "You are alive. We feared the worst." Catherine embraced her, her tears flowing freely. "I am alive," she said. "But Tristan, he is still at the castle. He sacrificed himself to save me." Alara's face paled, her eyes filled with grief. "Oh, my lady," she whispered. "I am so sorry." Catherine pulled back, her expression determined. "We have no time for sorrow, Alara," she said. "I need your help. I need you to take a message to Lord Elmsworth." She explained her plan, her voice low and urgent, outlining the contents of the letters, her desperate plea for help. Alara listened, her initial shock giving way to a fierce determination. "I will do it, my lady," she said, her voice firm. "I will risk my life to help you." Catherine handed her the letters, her hand trembling slightly. "Be careful, Alara," she said. "This is our only hope." Alara tucked the letters into her tunic, her expression resolute. "I will not fail you, my lady," she said. "I swear it." With a final, heart-wrenching look, Alara turned and disappeared into the forest, heading towards Lord Elmsworth's lands. Catherine was alone again, her fate hanging in the balance. But beyond all walls, beyond all of her training, she had made the right choice. She had to trust. Chapter 17. The Weight of Honor. Alara journeyed for days, traveling through forests and across fields, avoiding roads and villages, sticking to the shadows. She knew the risks, the dangers, the potential consequences of her actions. But her loyalty to Catherine, her commitment to justice, her belief in a better future, spurred her on. She finally reached Lord Elmsworth's castle, a formidable fortress perched on a hilltop, overlooking a vast expanse of land. She approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that gaining an audience with the Lord would be difficult, perhaps impossible. She presented herself at the gate, claiming to be a messenger from a distant village, carrying an urgent plea for help. The guards were skeptical, wary of strangers, unwilling to grant her access. But Alara persisted, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a desperate plea. She spoke of injustice, of treachery, of a noble lady in peril. She spoke of a plot that threatened not only Dunmere, but the entire kingdom. Her words, spoken with such conviction, such passion, finally reached one of the guards, an older man with a kind face and a sense of honor. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, the unwavering determination that burned within her. He agreed to take her message to Lord Elmsworth, warning her that it might be in vain. Alara waited, her nerves frayed, her hope dwindling. Hours passed, and she began to fear the worst. Finally, the guard returned, his expression unreadable. "Lord Elmsworth will see you," he said. "But be warned, he is a man of few words and even fewer tolerances." Alara was led through the castle, her eyes taking in the grandeur, the power, the history that emanated from the stone walls. She was brought to a large chamber, where Lord Elmsworth sat at a long table, surrounded by his advisors. He was a man of imposing stature, his hair silvered with age, his face lined with experience, his eyes sharp and piercing. He looked at Alara, his expression stern and unforgiving. "You claim to have an urgent message," he said, his voice deep and resonant. "Speak and be brief." Alara took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She presented the letters, her hand trembling slightly. She explained their contents, her voice clear and strong, outlining Catherine's story, Edric's treachery, Tristan's sacrifice. Lord Elmsworth listened intently, his expression unreadable. He read the letters, his eyes narrowing, his brow furrowing. He questioned Alara, probing her knowledge, testing her veracity. The tension in the chamber was palpable, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Alara's fate, Catherine's fate, Dunmere's fate, hung in the balance. Finally, Lord Elmsworth spoke, his voice filled with a cold fury. "This is an outrage," he said. "A betrayal of the highest order. I will not stand for it." He turned to his advisors, his expression resolute. "Prepare the men," he said. "We ride for Dunmere at dawn. We will bring Edric to justice, and we will restore Lady Catherine to her rightful place." Alara's heart leaped with relief, with gratitude, with hope. She had done it. She had reached Lord Elmsworth. She had convinced him to help. She had set in motion the events that would lead to Edric's downfall. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. Edric was a formidable foe, and he would not surrender without a fight. The weight of honor was heavy, but it was a burden she was willing to share for Catherine, for Tristan, for Dunmere, for justice. She had chosen the right side. Chapter 18. A Kingdom Divided. Lord Elmsworth's army marched on Dunmere, a force of hundreds of knights, men-at-arms and archers, their banners flying, their weapons gleaming in the morning sun. They were joined by men from Oakhaven, Elder Gareth and the villagers, armed with whatever weapons they could find, their faces grim and determined. They were fighting for their freedom, for their homes, for justice. Catherine, hidden amongst the ranks of the Oakhaven villagers, watched as they approached the castle, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She had been waiting for this moment, dreaming of this moment for weeks. But now that it was here, she was filled with a sense of dread. She knew that Edric would not surrender easily, that he would fight to the death to protect his ill-gotten power. She knew that blood would be spilled, lives would be lost, and the outcome was far from certain. As they drew closer, the castle gates opened, and Edric's forces poured out, a smaller but well-equipped army, their faces hardened, their eyes filled with a cold determination. Edric, clad in full armor, rode at their head, his sword drawn, his face a mask of arrogant defiance. He saw Lord Elmsworth, his expression turning to one of surprise, then anger. "Elmsworth," he roared, "what is the meaning of this? Why have you brought your army to my gates?" Lord Elmsworth rode forward, his voice booming across the battlefield. "I am here to bring you to justice, Edric," he said. "For the murder of Lord Alaric, for the usurpation of Dunmere, for your treachery against the crown." Edric laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You have no proof, Elmsworth," he said. "Only the lies of a desperate woman." Catherine stepped forward, her chin lifted, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I have the proof, Edric," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Your own letters, confessing your crimes." Edric's eyes narrowed, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He had not expected her to be here, to be alive, to have the evidence.
"Lies,"
he shouted. "All lies." But his words lacked conviction, his voice faltering. The tide was turning, the truth was emerging, and he was losing control. Lord Elmsworth raised his sword, his signal for attack. "For Dunmere,"
he cried.
"For justice." The two armies clashed, a maelstrom of steel and blood, the sounds of battle echoing across the fields. Catherine, despite her lack of training, fought alongside the Oakhaven villagers, her small dagger a symbol of her defiance, her determination. She saw Elder Gareth fall, an arrow piercing his chest, a cry of pain escaping his lips. She saw other villagers fall, their bodies littering the ground, their lives sacrificed for a cause they believed in. The battle raged on, a brutal, chaotic struggle, the outcome uncertain. Catherine fought with a fierce determination, fueled by her anger, her grief, her desire for revenge. She saw Edric, fighting like a madman, his sword cutting down anyone who stood in his way. He was a formidable opponent, skilled and ruthless. But he was also desperate, cornered, his power crumbling around him. He had lost the support of his allies, his men were wavering, his cause was lost. The kingdom was divided, but Dunmere was not. The people would not stand for his rule. Chapter 19. The Blade's Confession. The battle reached its climax, the field littered with the dead and dying, the air thick with the smell of blood and sweat. Edric, isolated and surrounded, fought with the desperation of a cornered animal, his sword a blur of motion, his face contorted with rage and hatred. Catherine, exhausted but resolute, found herself face to face with Sir Kelric, Edric's brutal enforcer. He sneered at her, his sword raised, ready to strike. "You should have stayed hidden, little bird," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "Now you will die." He lunged at her, his sword flashing in the sunlight. Catherine, despite her fear, stood her ground, her small dagger her only defense. She parried his blow, the force of the impact jarring her arm. She was no match for him, his strength and skill far superior to hers. But she refused to yield, her determination fueled by her desire for justice, her memory of Tristan, her love for her people. Suddenly, a figure appeared between them, deflecting Kelric's blow, his own sword engaging the mercenaries in a furious duel. It was Tristan. Catherine gasped, her heart leaping with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He was alive. He had survived. He was wounded, his armor battered, his face pale and bloodied. But his eyes burned with a fierce determination, his movements swift and deadly.
"Tristan!"
she cried, her voice filled with emotion. He glanced at her, a fleeting smile crossing his lips. "I told you," he said, his voice strained. "I would not let him harm you." He turned his attention back to Kelric, his focus unwavering. He fought with a renewed vigor, fueled by his love for Catherine, his desire for redemption, his commitment to justice. The duel was brief, but brutal. Tristan, despite his wounds, proved to be the superior swordsman. He disarmed Kelric, his blade piercing the mercenary's heart, a final, fatal blow. Kelric fell to the ground, his body lifeless, his eyes staring blankly at the sky. Tristan stood over him, his chest heaving, his sword dripping with blood. He turned to Catherine, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and love. He reached out to her, his hand trembling. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Before Catherine could reach him, Edric appeared, his sword raised, his face contorted with a final, desperate rage. He lunged at Tristan, aiming for a killing blow.
No.
Catherine screamed, her voice filled with horror. But Tristan was too weak, too slow. He could not defend himself. Edric's sword struck true, piercing Tristan's armor, drawing blood. Tristan staggered, his body collapsing to the ground, his eyes closing. Catherine rushed to his side, her heart shattering, her tears flowing freely. "Tristan!" she cried, cradling his head in her lap. "No, please." No. Edric stood over them, his sword raised, ready to deliver the final blow. But before he could strike, Lord Elmsworth's men surrounded him, their swords pointed at his throat. "It's over, Edric," Lord Elmsworth said, his voice cold and hard. "Surrender." Edric looked around, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. He was defeated, his army shattered, his allies gone, his power broken. He lowered his sword, his body slumping with defeat. He had lost. Catherine, oblivious to Edric's surrender, held Tristan close, her tears falling onto his face. She whispered his name, over and over, her heart breaking. Tristan then chose that moment to speak. "I thought that I would tell you myself, before the rumors did." He coughed, grimacing. "Edric. He is my brother." Chapter 20. Dawn of Redemption. Catherine stared at Tristan, her mind reeling, her heart pounding in her chest. Edric, his brother? The revelation was a shock, a twist of fate that she could not have anticipated. It explained so much, yet it also raised so many questions. "Your brother?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "But how?" Tristan coughed, his body racked with pain, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "A long story," he whispered. "A family secret." He struggled to speak, his voice weak and fading. Catherine held him tighter, her tears flowing freely, her fear for his life overwhelming her. "Don't talk," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Save your strength." Lord Elmsworth approached, his expression grim but compassionate.
"He needs a healer," he said.
"We must get him to safety." He signaled to his men, and they carefully lifted Tristan, carrying him away from the battlefield, towards the castle. Catherine followed, her hand clasped in Tristan's, her heart filled with a desperate hope. Edric was taken prisoner, his reign of terror finally over. He was led away in chains, his face a mask of defeat and despair. The battle was won, Dunmere was liberated, but the cost had been high. Tristan was taken to the castle, to Catherine's chambers, the very rooms where she had once lived in fear and captivity. He was laid on her bed, his body pale and still, his breathing shallow and uneven. The castle healers were summoned, their faces grim, their prognosis uncertain. They worked tirelessly, tending to his wounds, applying poultices, administering herbs. But Tristan's condition remained critical, his life hanging in the balance. Catherine sat beside him, holding his hand, watching his face, praying for a miracle. She spoke to him, softly, reassuringly, telling him of her love, of her hope, of her dreams for their future. She told him of the letters, of Edric's confession, of his downfall. She told him of the villagers of Oakhaven, of their bravery, of their loyalty. She told him of Lord Elmsworth, of his support, of his commitment to justice. Hours passed, and the night wore on. Catherine remained by Tristan's side, her vigil unwavering, her love a constant presence in the room. She refused to sleep, to eat, to leave his side, even for a moment. As dawn approached, Tristan's breathing grew more regular, his color returning, his body relaxing. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Catherine, his gaze weak but clear. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Tristan," she said, her voice filled with relief and joy. "You're alive. You're going to be all right." He smiled, a faint, weary smile that reached his eyes. "I told you," he whispered. "I wouldn't leave you." Catherine leaned down and kissed him, her tears falling onto his face. It was a kiss of love, of gratitude, of hope, of redemption. The dawn broke, casting a golden light over Dunmere, illuminating the castle, the fields, the forest. It was a new day, a new beginning, a new era. The serpent was defeated, the lioness had reclaimed her throne, and the blade had found its redemption. The scars of the past remained, but they were a reminder of the struggles they had overcome, the sacrifices they had made, the love that had sustained them. The long night had passed. Epilogue. The years that followed were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of renewal. Catherine, with Tristan by her side, ruled Dunmere with wisdom, compassion, and justice. They restored the castle, revived the lands, and brought prosperity back to the people. Tristan recovered from his wounds, his body scarred, but his spirit unbroken. He renounced his claim to his brother's legacy, choosing instead to serve Catherine, to protect Dunmere, to honor the memory of Lord Alaric. He never spoke of his past, of his brother, of the darkness that had haunted him for so long. But Catherine knew, and she loved him all the more for it. They were married in the castle chapel, a simple ceremony attended by the villagers of Oakhaven, Lord Elmsworth and his men, and the few remaining loyal servants of Dunmere. It was a celebration of love, of loyalty, of a new beginning. Catherine and Tristan had children, a son and a daughter, who grew up strong and proud, inheriting their parents' courage, their compassion, their sense of justice. They were taught the history of Dunmere, the story of their parents' struggles, the lessons of the past. Edric remained imprisoned, his fate a subject of much debate. Catherine, despite her initial desire for revenge, chose mercy. She could not bring herself to execute him, not after learning of his connection to Tristan. He was banished, stripped of his titles, his lands, his power. He disappeared into obscurity, a forgotten figure in the annals of history. The letters, the proof of Edric's treachery, were placed in the royal archives, a testament to the events that had transpired, a warning against the dangers of ambition, a reminder of the importance of justice. Catherine and Tristan ruled Dunmere for many years, their reign marked by peace, prosperity, and a deep love for their people. They were remembered as wise and just rulers, their names revered, their story a legend. As they grew old, they often walked together in the castle gardens, the same gardens where they had first met, where their love had blossomed, where their struggles had begun. They would sit beneath the ancient oak tree, their hands clasped, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had faced darkness, they had endured betrayal, they had overcome adversity. But they had found love, they had found redemption, they had found their happily ever after. It wasn't a fairy tale, there was no magic, only the courage to do what was right. The story of their lives and the fight had echoed down through generations, and a new dawn had begun. The end.